We're just coming to the end of this book of fasting. So without further ado, the author says, may Allah have mercy upon him. Expiation. Now we want to talk about the Kaffarah. Kaffarah is the expiation. And this is different from the fidyah, which we translated as redemption payment. So when it comes to a broken fast, you have three things. You don't want to get them mixed up. One of them is merely making up the fast. Just because you broke your fast doesn't mean you have to pay anything. The other thing is a redemption payment, a fidyah. That's going to be when you're sick without hope for recovery. So you don't fast on some days. You need to pay a redemption payment. Or because of being elderly, so you don't fast on some days, you need to pay a redemption payment. Or if a woman broke her fast only for the sake of her child, she's a pregnant woman or a nursing woman, she broke her fast only for the sake of her child, she had no personal fear of fasting. She broke her fast for someone else altogether, not for herself. Then she's going to have to make it up and pay a redemption payment, both of those. The one who's sick without hope for recovery doesn't have to make it up because he has no hope for recovery. So he only has to do an expiation payment. The elderly, he's not going to have to make it up because he has no hope for youth. So he's only going to have to do an expiation. But a woman, a pregnant woman or nursing woman who broke her fast only for the sake of her child, not for her own sake, she is going to have to make it up and she's going to have to pay a redemption payment. And also, if a person did not make up a fast before the next Ramadan came, even if the person had an excuse to delay, but he didn't make it up before the next Ramadan came, then he's going to have to pay an expiation payment for letting the next Ramadan come without having made up the fast. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. We talked about all of that already. Now we want to talk about something different from fidyah. We want to talk about Kaffarah. And this is for the one who sinfully broke his fast by sexual intercourse in particular. Kaffarah is only for someone who sinfully broke the fast by sexual intercourse, as we're going to see here. So the author says, if intentional sexual intercourse, so not forced, we talk about the man here, not the woman. All of this does not apply to the woman. Yani, none of this applies to the woman. If intentional sexual intercourse during a complete daytime of Ramadan by someone accountable to fast, who intended at night, invalidates the fast sinfully, one must not only make up the fast immediately after the Eid, if able, but also one must fulfill as an expiation one of three things that have a mandatory sequence. Okay, so let's unpack that. If intentional sexual intercourse, so you know what sexual intercourse means. It means for the glands of the man to disappear into the private part of the woman. So if this happened, and this breaks the man's fast, as for the woman, her fast is broken before the entire gland disappears into her private part. So this doesn't apply to her because her fast is not broken by sexual intercourse. We talked about that before. During a complete daytime of Ramadan, what does that mean? A complete daytime of Ramadan. What would be contrary to a complete daytime of Ramadan? Yani, what's an incomplete day? A day that got nullified by, for example, insanity or death. So we're saying a man who was obligated to fast, he had sexual intercourse during the daytime of Ramadan, and this breaks his fast. Now, when this sexual intercourse breaks his fast, let's say for the sake of this chapter, to understand this chapter, this does not X out his day. Now, yes, his fast is invalidated, but the daytime from Fajr to Maghrib is not voided. It's not X'd out. It's still green. His fast is invalidated, but the daytime is still, we're going to say, green. Yani green means go. But what if, although he did invalidate his fast by sexual intercourse, he went crazy that day before the sun went down? So his going crazy on that day will X out that day. Now, it's red day. Gets X'd out. Now this is an incomplete daytime of Ramadan. And so there's not going to be an expiation on this person. Yes, he did break his fast by sexual intercourse sinfully, but his day got voided by something like insanity or even death itself. So then there's no expiation on this person. So if sexual intercourse, intentional sexual intercourse during a complete daytime of Ramadan, a daytime of Ramadan, not a daytime outside of Ramadan. What if a person were making up the fast of Ramadan? So that means it's not Ramadan. You can't make up a day of fasting during Ramadan. So if he's making up a day of fasting, which automatically means it's outside of Ramadan, and so this is an obligatory fast, and it is forbidden for him to break this fast, and then he has sexual intercourse on this day, effectively breaking his fast. There's no expiation for him here, because this expiation is for breaking the fast by sexual intercourse in the daytime of Ramadan in particular. So if intentional sexual intercourse during a complete daytime of Ramadan by someone who's accountable to fast, he's accountable to fast, Yani. He doesn't have an excuse to not fast. He's not a traveler. He's not sick. He doesn't have any excuse to break his fast. He's accountable to fast because if he had an excuse, then he can break his fast by sexual intercourse or by otherwise. If he were a traveler and he was fasting as a traveler, he still could break his fast by sexual intercourse. If a person were a traveler, he has permission now to break his fast. So he can break his fast even by sexual intercourse. Or if a person had permission to break his fast for any other reason, not just traveling. So then this person has no expiation here. So if intentional sexual intercourse during a complete daytime of Ramadan by someone who's accountable to fast, and this one intended at night, this one who's accountable to fast indeed intended at night. If he didn't intend at night, that's haram because that's an integral of the fast, the intention. But if he didn't fast at night, if he didn't intend at night and then in the daytime of Ramadan he had sexual intercourse, then he did not invalidate his fast by this sexual intercourse. Rather, his fast is not valid because he never even made an intention. So since he never made an intention, then means his fast is not valid. If his fast is not valid, then if he had sexual intercourse during the daytime of Ramadan, that's still haram because he's obligated to honor the time, but he's not going to have to fulfill an expiation because he did not invalidate his fast by sexual intercourse. How he didn't invalidate his fast by sexual intercourse? He didn't invalidate his fast by sexual intercourse because he didn't even make his intention. So if intentional sexual intercourse during a complete daytime of Ramadan by someone accountable to fast who intended at night invalidates the fast sinfully, yani if this sexual intercourse invalidates the fast sinfully, then one must not only make up the fast, one must not only make up the fast immediately, but he's going to have to also fulfill the expiation. Now, why does it say that this fast invalidates? Why does it say that this sexual intercourse invalidates the fast? Doesn't sexual intercourse invalidate the fast? Yes, it does. So why it's saying if this intentional sexual intercourse invalidates the fast? Because he might have forgot he was fasting. If he forgot he was fasting, so he had sexual intercourse, then his fast is not invalidated. and therefore he does not have to fulfill an expiation. So, if intentional sexual intercourse during a complete daytime of Ramadan by someone accountable to fast, who intended at night, if such a sexual intercourse invalidates the fast sinfully, then one must not only make up the fast immediately after the Eid, if able, but also he must fulfill as an expiation one of three things that have a mandatory sequence. What are those three things? The first is to free a believing male or female slave. One must free a believing male or female slave without defects that hinder work. So, what kind of slave? A believing one, not a kafir slave, male or female, doesn't matter, that doesn't have any defects that hinder work. So it could have a defect as long as it's not the kind of defect that hinders work. What kind of defect would hinder work? Like an obvious limp or a missing thumb. What kind of defect would not hinder work? Like no eyebrows. So the first thing that this person has to do is free a believing male or female slave that doesn't have any defects that hinder work. If he didn't find one, either because he can't afford it, there are available, but he can't afford it, or there aren't any available, then he goes to the next issue. Fasting 2 consecutive lunar months, other than the invalidated day. Fasting 2 consecutive lunar months. Consecutive means you can't break, you can't skip a day. Now, knowing that there are days that are haram to fast, like the Eid and the days of Tashriq, then if this were your case, then you need to time this. Because if you break even one day out of these 2 consecutive lunar months, you have to start over from the beginning. Even if you broke it with an excuse, you have to start over from the beginning. It's a condition that those are 2 consecutive lunar months. And those 2 months are other than the invalidated day. So the person's going to have to make up the invalidated day after the Eid, and then he needs to fast for 2 consecutive months for breaking his fast in this way and not being able to free a slave. For your information, up until here, for your information, is also the expiation for the murderer. If someone committed murder, a Muslim committed murder, then he needs to free a believing slave. If he can't, then he has to fast for 2 consecutive months. And when it comes to murder, it stops there. But for breaking the fast by sexual intercourse, there's another one. If unable, he feeds 60 poor Muslims, each a mud bowl of the town's most common staple. If unable, he feeds 60 poor Muslims. So that means he can't give the bowl to the same poor Muslim every time. As opposed to the fidya. For the fidya, the redemption payment, you can give your redemption payment to the same poor Muslim every time. And mud bowl, what does that mean? You know what's a mud? A mud is 2 average size hands cupped together. So that's mud. And the word bowl here is just for the sake of your comprehension, to perhaps make it easier for you. If you put those 2 average size hands together, then they are like a bowl full of the town's most common staple. What does staple mean anyway? The staple is what the people eat commonly. Some people's staple might be meat, actually. So what we mean, though, is a staple that is subject to zakah. So that means it's going to be wheat or rice, some sort of grain or cereal if you want. Or it could be dates or raisins. Whichever is the town's most common staple. The most common zakat applicable staple. Meat is not subject to zakat. If unable to do any, one remains liable. Whichever he becomes able to do, he does. Whenever it becomes available, then he does the first one that becomes available. If sexual intercourse were repeated on a second day of Ramadan, then a second expiation is due upon him. However, if the intercourse were repeated on one day, he only has one expiation. The expiation for the intercourse that broke his fast sinfully. However, he does have a sin for each time he does it. Here's the hadith. It is what is narrated by the two sheikhs that a man came to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam and said, and I'll just read the English. He said, I'm ruined. So the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, what has ruined you? He said, I fell upon my wife during Ramadan. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, do you have what frees a slave? He said, no. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, are you able to fast for 2 consecutive months? He said, no. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, do you have what feeds 60 poor Muslims? He said, no. And then he sat. That's it. He didn't ask him more. So those are your 3 options. In that order. If you can't do any of them, then when something becomes available, that's what you have to do. So the hadith continues. Then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was approached with a container of dates. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, give this as a charity. It means, use this to fulfill your expiation. So the man said, should I give it to someone poorer than we are? I swear by Allah that there is no one poorer than we are. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam smiled until his canine teeth showed up. Yani, that man's words amused him, alayhi salatu wassalam. And then he said, go and feed it to your family. But this doesn't relieve the man of the expiation altogether. So when one becomes able, he has to do, when one becomes able by anything, then he'll have to do whatever he's able to do. Any question about the expiation?